he is going to be having a state visit to the UK. If he does a speech in Parliament, are you planning on being there?
Well, definitely not, for many reasons. But I think this thing about the judgment really is a very important moment in the US and also for the wider world. Because what he's done is he's criticised the judge that has said this blanket ban on people coming from Muslim countries is unconstitutional and has struck it down. Now, Trump's appeal against that has been rejected. And Trump was criticising the judge, calling him a so-called judge. And the point is that in our democracies, what we're supposed to have is elected people, but the elected people are not above the law, and therefore the rule of law must cover government, and government must act lawfully. And the worry is that Trump is going to try and somehow override the law. And the worry is not just for America, that actually even the president must obey the law, but for all other countries where people are struggling for their rights and where the courts are important to prevent government abusing their powers. So it's a real constitutional crisis now, Trump versus the rule of law and the Constitution.
So how should the UK react then to this?
Well, they should be saying that not just in America, but all around the world, people look to America. And if America says, well, government's above the law, we can do what we like once we're elected, even if it's abusing people's human rights, then that's a very bad message. And May should be sending signals through, Theresa May should be sending signals through to the Trump administration saying, don't undermine the rule of law. It's absolutely fundamental. Heaven knows what he's going to be doing next. We'll probably find out on a tweet.
Now, you've been in Westminster for 35 years. You've certainly seen a number of ups and downs in your time there, but perhaps nothing quite like the situation that Labour finds itself in now. It does seem to be in somewhat of an existential crisis. The polls are pretty abysmal. You're hopelessly divided on Brexit. You've got two big by-election tests coming up in Stoke and in Copeland. Is now the time for the Labour Party to look to collaborate with other left-wing parties like the Greens and the Lib Dems?
I don't think so. And I think, there are painful echoes of the 1980s and what was happening to the Labour Party in the 1980s to what is happening now. I mean, then we were divided, we were lagging behind in the polls, we were in a lot of difficulties. And then people said, there'll have to be a realignment of UK politics. The Labour Party will have to merge with the Lib Dems. And actually, what it needed was for Labour to get its act together. Instead of shouting at the public and telling the public they were getting it wrong, we had to listen to them and understand where we were getting it wrong. And that's what we've got to do again. So certainly, I think we're not in the situation we want to be in. We really need to sort ourselves out. But I don't think it's an existential crisis. I think it's a very bad time. And that's a problem because we do need a strong opposition at a time of, when we're going through Brexit.
It's interesting that you draw this link between what's happening now and what's happening in the 80s. It's something you mention as well in your book when you talk about these days back in the 1980s when left-wing party members were shouting at MPs to resign, when local party meetings were kind of wrought with arguments. This was your conclusion in the book. We can have a quick look now. You said, infighting turned the public off voting for us. Is that happening now? Is Labour unelectable in its current state?
I think that it causes great worry amongst our supporters and turns off...
So is it unelectable right now, would you say?
Well, no, we're not unelectable. We have loads of elected Labour MPs. But you mean, are we an effective opposition and are we a credible alternative government? I think you can't be an effective opposition if you haven't got enough public support, because the government doesn't need to worry about you. They only look at their own side. They don't be concerned about us. So we do need more public support in order to be an effective opposition, let alone a credible alternative government. We have definitely got work to do.
So you're not an effective opposition now, it seems to be what you're saying.
I think we're not as effective as we could be because we haven't got public support. So it's no good having the right arguments or just speaking very loudly. You actually have to have the public on your side to make the government take any notice of you at all.
And of course, one of the big areas where perhaps there is a need for an effective opposition is Brexit. Labour is very divided on Brexit, and potentially the situation isn't helped by leading MPs like Diane Abbott not showing up for the vote on Article 50?
Well, I think the country's divided on Brexit. I know that, those of us who wanted Remain, we lost, and the Leave won, so we are going to have Brexit. But that doesn't change the fact that actually the country was pretty much split down the middle. And I think the Labour Party overall was very much in favour of Remain, but it's the tactics now that the party is divided on, not the principles. We still want to make sure that there's social justice, economic prosperity. We want the country to be united. All of those principles remain the same, but tactically it's very difficult. And when you're in opposition, often it's only bad choices. You don't set the context, and therefore it's a very turbulent time. But I don't think we're divided in principle. We're just some are divided in tactics. I hate to vote for Article 50 because I wanted us to stay in the EU, but I recognise that that decision was taken in June. We've got to ratify it in the House of Commons, but we've got to make the best of the bad situation we're in for the country and make sure the government do as well as they can for the country and not make things even worse.
So it's clearly a difficult decision for MPs like yourself, particularly who have Remain areas that you represent in Parliament.
Yeah.
So how disappointed were you that Diane Abbott didn't show up for this vote?
Well, she said she was ill and unable to vote, and I think, you just have to accept that. I've known
Other
in the
MPs
past
had cancer and managed to be.
Well, I know, but you see, I've known in the past where people have criticised MPs, and it did turn out they were ill. I remember when Mo Molan was very unwell, and the newspapers all jeered at her. And actually, she had a very serious illness. I'm not saying Diane's got a serious illness. I'm just saying give people the benefit of the doubt. And the other thing is that Diane had actually been on TV saying she was going to vote for Article 50, so she'd already taken the flak on it. So I'm just assuming that she didn't vote because she wasn't well. But anyway, what was quite ironic is that we had 400 MPs plus going through the division lobby, Labour and Tories. The overwhelming majority of them didn't want to be voting what they were voting for, but because there's been a referendum, we sort of had to ratify it. So it was like the unhappiest night of voting in the House of Commons I've ever been in for all the MPs that were in the division lobby. But since the referendum was lost, well, we just have to get on with it.
Now, I'm interested to talk about your time as a woman in Westminster. Ever since you entered the House of the Commons, it seems you were determined to try and focus relentlessly on women's issues. You've been pretty relentlessly criticised for that by some quarters, calling you Harriet Harman person. In your book, you talk, for example, about some Labour MPs seeing you as a humourless feminist. Have there been any times when you've gone back to your office and had a good cry about it or wanted to quit?
Well, not crying about it, but I've certainly, especially when the children were young in the early days, it just felt too much. Because, I was part of the women's movement. We wanted to get into Parliament and change everything. But it's one thing knowing what you want to do. It's quite another when you meet real opposition, especially from your own side. So I did want to quit a lot, but I promised my constituents that I would fight for them. And I was part of the women's movement, and we knew that getting change would be hard, so I had to stick it out. But the main purpose was not just having women MPs for the sake of it, but because women still lead very different lives from men. Women still have most of the responsibility for childcare and for the care of older relatives. It's women who suffer most from domestic violence. There's a whole load of issues which are important for women, and women's voices need to be there in the House of Commons, otherwise those voices get overlooked.
Now, Labour, of course, have put lots of women in the House of Commons, but something where you've been slightly less good is getting women in the top jobs. I'm just going to show you now the women who've run for the Labour leadership in the past, and I find it astonishing that they've all placed below men. So women have come bottom whenever they've run for the Labour leadership. I mean, what's going on? Has Labour got a problem with women?
Well, it is a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Because we've got more Labour women MPs than all the other parties put together, and yet we don't seem to be able to get a Labour leader who's a woman. And in fact, at the moment, we've got two men in the leadership, the leader and the deputy. And that is a problem for the party that is the party of women and of equality, which Labour prides itself on being. How come is it that the Tories can get not just one woman Prime Minister, but two, for heaven's sake? So we have got to sort ourselves out on that. But it's not just having a woman at the top, it's actually having the policies that, like childcare and things like that really help women in practice.
But I just want to go back to this point, because I just think it is, for a party that prides itself on women's issues and equality, every woman who's run has placed below a man. In the Conservatives, every woman who's run has placed above a man. What's going on? There must be something in Labour that makes it harder for women to get to the top.
Well, if I knew what the magic, if it is a paradox. If I knew what the sort of magic problem, the problem was, and we could just throw a switch and change it. But, certainly, I think more and more people are beginning to recognise that it just looks downright old-fashioned to think that, men have to make the decisions and women have to abide by them. I was brought up at a time when there was the old phrase that men were men and women were glad of it. Well, we just need to move a bit beyond that in the Labour Party, I think.
And, of course, you've served under many of these male leaders that we've had. How would you rate Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Ed Miliband on their record on promoting women and encouraging women's issues to the foreground?
Well, I first came in whether it was Michael Foot, and, that was really before the days of the women's movement had really got going into politics. Neil Kinnock was a real strong supporter of women in politics, and Tony Blair presided over 100 Labour women coming into the House of Commons and loads of policies that helped change things. Gordon Brown doubled maternity pay and leave. And
he also didn't make you Deputy Prime Minister when you were Deputy Leader.
Which he should have done, and I should have made him, but, that's, another story. So I think that it's down to all of us. It's not just down to the leader. It's down to all of us to say, OK, it can't just carry on like reigning men in the Labour Party. Men at the top have got to share power with women. That hasn't happened yet, but it's got to. It's part of really changing Labour to make us, the modern, equal, progressive party we ought to be.
You say men at the top haven't shared power with women. Does that also apply to Jeremy Corbyn? Of course, he was criticised initially for not putting women in the top jobs.
Well, I wouldn't, Jeremy Corbyn's leader now, but it's been the same old. He's not the first person who's not had, who's been leader in a not yet equal Labour Party. So I think it's work in progress, but we need to get a move on.
And he should do more.
Well, all leaders, obviously we should be doing more to make sure that this equality happens. Yes, of course he should be. We all should be.
I'm also keen to get your thoughts on social media, which feels like it's a new challenge for women in politics. These horrific stories of rape threats, of, death threats on some occasions. What do you think is going on in society that we have a situation where women have to put up with this?
Well, I think it's this whole issue about social media and bullying and threatening on social media is not just a question for women in politics. It's a question for women, and especially young women, all around. And I think that actually the women in the House of Commons, many of who've suffered this, are going to be the people who will help sort it out. Because many young women and girls' lives are made an absolute misery by what is going on online. And it's a wonderful way of communicating. Of course, it's an amazing sort of digital revolution. But actually it's got a dark side, and we need to make sure that we keep progressing with all this, digital engagement, but we deal with the worst elements of it. And actually the women MPs who've had death threats, who've had rape threats, they've been at the sharp edge of it. They definitely know how bad it feels, and they'll be the ones that will drive getting it sorted out.
And of course, some of the worst abuse has come from some of the left-wing members or supporters of the Labour Party. Some of it is being done in Jeremy Corbyn's name, even if he himself has condemned it. Does he need to be stronger?
Oh, yes, he does. What he says is, I don't condone it, and it's not being done on my behalf. But when you're a leader, you have to do more than that. You have to say, I'm against it, I condemn it, and this is what I'm going to do about it to stop it, and then do that. So I think being a leader is not just saying it's a bad thing, it's doing something about it.
Do you think he's failing women in the Labour Party by not doing more?
I think he should take action about it, not just say, I'm not in favour of it. It's not good enough to say it's all awful. When you're the leader of the party, you're actually in a position to do something about it.
Just a quick thought from you to end, Harriet. Do you regret not running for the Labour Party leadership yourself?
Well, in a way, I do. And I think the moment I should have run is in 2010 when Gordon stood down. But it sort of took everybody by surprise because we thought he would stay and hand over. And then I became acting leader and suddenly realised I could do it. At that moment, I should have stepped forward. And it's a bit of a mystery to me why I didn't. But I think the world is full of men who are not up to the job, pushing themselves forward, and loads of women who are up to the job who don't. And for that moment, I was probably one of them. Fortunately, people like you, Sophie, are surging forward.
Thank you very much, Harriet Harman.